I am your moderator, Kizike Peters. Tonight, we will be exploring How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, a powerful and influential work that has shaped discussions in African and Caribbean history for decades. As we engage with Rodney's powerful arguments, it is also important to connect our discussion to contemporary efforts aimed at justice and recognition. The International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana, with its theme of recognition, justice, and development, reminds us that the historical processes Rodney examined still influence present day struggles for equality. Walter Rodney was a Guyanese historian, scholar, and activist born in Georgetown in 1942. Growing in colonial Guyana shaped his understanding of inequality and exploitation. His Caribbean background also allowed him to connect Africa's history with the experiences of the Caribbean and the wider Atlantic world. He later became an internationally respected academic and strong voice in anti-colonial and Pan-African thought. Dr. Rodney was also a co-founder of the Working People's Alliance. In his book, published in 1972, Rodney argued that Africa's underdevelopment was not natural nor accidental. Instead, it was the result of centuries of European exploitation through enslavement, colonialism, and capitalism. He showed that Europe's wealth and Africa's poverty were historically connected. He argued that the transatlantic slave trade dominated relations between Europe and Africa. European powers such as Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands built an enormous system of human trafficking. Of African men, women, and children were captured, sold, and transported across the Atlantic, while merchants, shipbuilders, bankers, and insurance brokers all benefited from this system. Rodney argued that roads and railways built during the colonial rule were designed to serve European economic interests rather than the needs of African communities. To help guide us through this important discussion is Dr. David Hinds, member of Parliament and outstanding political activist. Dr. Hinds is a leader of the Working People's Alliance and was recently sworn in to his first term as an opposition member of Guyana's 13th Parliament. In doing so, he has drawn public admiration for reviving the tradition of Yusi Kwayana, appearing in Parliament in African attire as a powerful affirmation of cultural pride and political consciousness. Dr. Hinds recently retired as an associate professor of African and African American Studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University, where he specialized in Caribbean and African diaspora studies. His scholarship has explored governance and politics in the Caribbean, race, ethnicity, and politics in the African diaspora, African diaspora such as music and sports, and political discourse and black political leadership. He continues to be a principled and influential voice in the ongoing struggle for justice, dignity, and the advancement of African people in Guyana and across the wider Caribbean. It is truly a privilege to have him guide us through this timely and meaningful discussion. Dr. Hines, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sister Peters, and it's a great pleasure to be here tonight under the auspices of the International Decade of the People of African Descent, Guyana. And of course, to be sitting alongside yourself, a young person. I will have to go back decades to remember when I was a young person doing what you were doing. And it's always a pleasure to see the next generation get into this business, this journey, because it is indeed a
Journey.
journey. And so I want to give thanks for that. You mentioned the name there, Iusi Kwayana, and I want to say here tonight that that person has influenced me tremendously. He's a remarkable human being. I don't for a moment want to say that I emulate Kwayana. because stimulating is quite a job. But I don't know where I would be intellectually, politically, and otherwise had it not been for the influence of Guyana. And I think this country really is indebted to him. And it was good last year as he observed his 100th birth anniversary to see the country stop and to say thanks. Just a couple of days ago, as we entered the Committee of Supply um, to look at the estimates, at 101 years old, he sent me some voice notes with some advice on how to conduct myself in Parliament. I was so moved by it. I played it today for some young people in Boxing, and they were amazed at the clarity of his thought. They said, "Well, brother, you see, is here, because of the clarity." That's what one of the not so young man, asked. And so I just want to say thanks to brother UC again for what he has done for our country, what he has done for African Guyanese, what he has done for our region and the world at large. Um, I also want to make a disclaimer that we're examining Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and that I knew Walter Rodney. He was, again, a tremendous influence on my life. The fact that I'm an academic today has to do with Walter Rodney. I didn't want to be an academic. I was comfortable being a political activist. But when I saw Walter Rodney in action as a young 15, 16-year-old, I realized that you could be a political activist and an academic at the same time. And so, therefore, I just want to make that disclaimer that I may be biased in terms of how I treat the book, but it's very difficult um, to be biased as far as Walter Rodney is concerned. Maybe if you know him. I remember when I was in graduate school, I was in a class on Caribbean politics, and we were discussing the Black Power movement. And in my contribution to the class, I talked about, the contributions of other people. I didn't mention Walter Rodney's name because I thought it would be obvious to all my fellow students. When I was finished, one American student got up in rage and said, "How could my colleague be talking about Black Power in the Caribbean and the African diaspora and don't mention the name Walter Rodney?" He was enraged. And the professor started to laugh. And the student one, he said, "Well, actually, David knew Walter Rodney personally. He's a brother of Walter Rodney." And I say that to say the tremendous impact that Rodney has had on the thinking of uh, academics and political activists and so on. That this student was enraged that here I was from the Caribbean and didn't mention the name Walter Rodney. Of Europe on the Developed Africa, as you said in your introduction, has been an influential book. It has shaped the thinking of historians, academics in general, political activists for the better part of 5 to 6 decades. It is easily the most influential history book on Africa and the African diaspora. Uh, Interestingly, um, what I'm going to try to do here is to give some context for the book because it is such a popular book. I'm sure almost everyone in the audience would have either read the book, heard so much of the book, so I wouldn't want to bore them with what they would have known already. Walter Rodney went to the University of the West Indies in 1960 as an 18-year-old guy. And he said in his autobiography that they were asked to write an essay, write two essays, to write one on Africa and one on Europe. And he said he rattled off his essay on Europe and realized he could not write an essay on Africa. He was a bright student coming from Queen's College, right? And at that moment, he said he made a decision to study African history. And that is what took him to study African history. When he was finished at UWI, he went on to the School of Oriental Studies and Oriental and African Studies in England, and the rest is history. He left, he went to Tanzania, the University of Dar es Salaam. He taught there for a year, and then he came back to UWI in Jamaica, and he taught there for a year. And he wanted to teach African history in the history department at UWI in Mona, and they would not allow him. And so he went to the street corner and started to teach African history, mainly to Rastafarians and young in a city men and excuse me and women. And the government got scared of that. And he was banned from re-entering Jamaica after attending a conference, a Black Writers Conference in Montreal in October 1968. He left after he was not permitted to enter Jamaica. He went for a brief moment to Cuba, and then he went back to the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So he would have spent 1969 to 1974. The book is first published in 1972 by Bogolo Chor, which was a book published with Guyanese connection. Eric Huntley, he just died, I think, 2 weeks ago. He and his wife Jessica, they were members of the early PPP, the Jagan and Burnham and Quayana and Ashton Chase and Janet Jagan and so forth. And they did the first publication in 1972, and then Howard University published it in 1974. Now, the basis of the book were lectures that Rodney gave to teachers in Tanzania. He was giving this lecture series to teachers in Tanzania, and it is out of those lectures that came this how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Incidentally, he also would lecture to freedom fighters at that time, the so-called frontline states. Tanzania, the freedom fighters were fighting against apartheid in what is now Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, in South Africa. They would be in Tanzania and Angola, and he would lecture to them on African history. So it is out of that experience of lecturing to these students that this book came into being. Now, in order to understand the book, I would argue strenuously, one has to understand the world in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. One has to understand what was happening in Africa at that time, what was happening in the Caribbean and Latin America and Asia at that time, to understand what is motivating Walter Rodney to write this book of Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Now, the book, as you said in your introduction, engage the issue of development and underdevelopment because we are moving into this period of post-colonialism. Um, Ghana gets its independence in 1958, the first sub-Saharan African country. Trinidad and Jamaica in the English-speaking Caribbean in 1962. Guyana and Barbados would follow in 1966. So it is the decolonization period, the period that I call making the transition from plantation to nation. A tremendous work. These countries in Africa and the Caribbean are finding out that they are becoming independent, but they are inheriting all the structural problems of colonialism and slavery and so forth. That here they were now, independent countries, having to engage a world that was not made for them. Because at the end of the Second World War, the victors of that war, the Europeans, meaning England, France, the Americans, the Russians, that time they were the Soviet Union, they got together in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. And they sat down there and decided how the world is going to be run. It's called the Bretton Woods Agreement or the Washington Consensus. And it was out of that meeting that came institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, of course, and so forth. So they carve out the world for themselves. And here were these African countries and Caribbean countries becoming independent in a world that was not made for them. All right? And the question of development, they came up with this term underdeveloped countries and developing countries and developed countries. And countries like Guyana and Trinidad and Jamaica, Ghana, Tanzania are considered underdeveloped. And so Rodney's generation has the task or take it upon themselves the task of explaining this so-called underdevelopment. And so Rodney's argument is that this underdevelopment was not always there. There was a time when Africa was developed. And that the fact that it is so-called underdeveloped today has to do with what happened between then and now. And so he takes on that task in this book. So the world, we're having decolonization in Africa, in the Caribbean, Latin America had gotten, most of them have gotten their independence before, but they're still in the period of decolonizing the Asian countries, India, and so forth. And so it is that world that is driving Rodney and his generation. He came from a school of thought called the dependency school of thought. And they're arguing that look, there is this core of big countries that are dominating the world, and then the rest of the countries are on the periphery. And these countries that are on the periphery are dependent on these large countries. So Guyana, for example, nationalized its bauxite industry in the late 60s or early 70s, but found that they had to contract a company from Canada to market their bauxite, right? They have to sell their bauxite to the very countries that they're trying to. And so Rodney is grappling with this relationship between development and underdevelopment and trying to make sense of it from the standpoint of Africa and the Caribbean. Something else is happening in the world that is influencing Rodney, and that is that in the United States of America, the civil rights movement, which was raging, the last phase of the civil rights movement, raging from the 1950s into the 1960s. In 1964, Congress in the United States passed the Civil Rights Act, which basically made African Americans real full citizens of America constitutionally. And the next year, the Voting Rights Act, which actually gave them the actual right to vote, although that right was given constitutionally before. And so we come to the end of the civil rights movement. And African Americans are finding out that, look, we are now quote unquote free, but we can't afford to live. We are not economically free. We are not politically free. And so you move from the civil rights movement to the Black Power movement, where now Black people in the United States are saying we have to deal with the question of Black empowerment. And soon in the Caribbean, in 1968, as Rodney is banned from Jamaica, the rise of the Black Power movement here in the Caribbean. In Africa, we saw the rise of the Black consciousness movement. Steve Biko would come out of that movement and so forth. So it is the combination of the Black Power movement and the Third Worldist movement arguing that our underdevelopment in the third world is not accidental, as you said there in your introduction. I think you really summarized the book perfectly. And so these two currents are what influence in Rodney and what goes in to how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And so I think if one contextualizes what Rodney is doing, one gets a better appreciation of this book. It's amazing what Rodney did different in this book. Prior to this book, African history, scholars were mostly white, and they were mostly anthropologists. So I remember as a small boy seeing these little pictures with big tummy African children, because this is what white people are saying Africa is. And so, and then you had the other scholars who, when they look at development and underdevelopment in Africa and the Caribbean, they're dealing with it strictly from an economic standpoint. Rodney breaks with that. Rodney is now looking at it through a broader prism, through the prism of politics, through the prism of sociology, and he's saying to understand the economic impact of slavery, of colonialism on Africa, on the Caribbean, one has to move beyond economics and move to a broader understanding of what happens in the society. So he's creating a new model for understanding on the development that moves beyond just a strict economics. So you take a Professor Clive Thomas, who's Rodney's contemporary, who's an economist, but we describe Professor Thomas as a developmental economist because he's an economist, but he's not dealing with economics from the standpoint of the Europeans and what they would teach you in the universities. He's adopting the same kind of framework and saying economics has to be linked to politics, it has to be linked to religion, it has to be linked to sociology. And so that is what Rodney does in this book. Perhaps I would argue the highlight of Rodney's book, always for me, is the introduction, the first chapter, where he defines development and underdevelopment. I remember as a young man reading that thing, and they said, God, your skin grow. Because you're learning something. What they call the dialectics of development and underdevelopment. He's arguing that that underdevelopment and development are intrinsically linked. That your development is as a result of somebody else's underdevelopment. And I remember as a small boy reading that, being mesmerized. And so later on, when I would teach this book, I would see young people really coming alive. Not so much with the notion of development, but the notion of underdevelopment and its link. And so I think that is a very powerful chapter in the book. It's one of those books when you read the first chapter, you don't want to stop, because the first chapter tickles you so much, right, that you want to go on. So he in that first chapter, he deals with the question of development and underdevelopment. Then he goes on to say, here is what Africa used to look like before white people, before Europeans came. And he would show the development. You were a young Africanist, and so you would know about pre-colonial Africa, the kingdoms, the trade, Timbuktu University. You couldn't be an underdeveloped society when you were developing the first university in the world. When you were developing trade, using the camel to trade from the African kingdoms with Asians, you couldn't be underdeveloped. And so Rodney traces that development in pre-colonial Africa to show technology, the agriculture technology, the metal technology, and so forth. And so he makes the case in that chapter that here was a developed country, a developed continent. And then he goes to Europe and shows that Europe was a backward feudal society. All right? That was nowhere near what you call development of Africa. And so he shows the contrast between these two. And then he says, the Europeans came to Africa. And you can see, starting with the transatlantic slave trade, which bled 12 million people out of Africa. You're not taking 12 million people out of what was then the population and tell me that you are not underdeveloping that place. It's the human capital that was taken forcibly away from Africa. And so he's arguing that in pre-colonial Africa, they began to remove wealth, both in terms of human wealth, both in terms of raw materials from Africa. And then he goes on to the colonial period in Africa and shows the escalation of the extraction of wealth from Africa. Now, it's interesting, eh? Africa became colonized after in the Caribbean because we come out of slavery here in 1838, right? And we enter the period what we now call colonization. And in Africa, it's towards the end of the 19th century when the Europeans sat down. There you go. I love that. I love that in Morning. The man scrambled for Africa, divided Africa, and so forth. And so Africa became colonized. And it is that juncture at the late 19th century that you're seeing the birth of the Pan-African movement, because Africa is now colonized, the Caribbean is now colonized, America is colonized. So Quick and Michael would later develop the colonized model, which he argues that African Americans, although there is not a mother country that is colonizing them, the social and political economic relations between Black America and white America is a colonial model. Manning Marble would later write a book, how white America underdeveloped Black America. And so the birth of the Pan-African movement there. And so Rodney is arguing and exploring the impact of colonialism on underdevelopment in Africa. I know time is, I want to shut up as quickly as possible to hear other people. Here is the thing. Rodney has written a book, but buried in that book, maybe not buried in that book, but very much alive in that book, is a model for us to use to understand society. Now, we in Guyana, we are now, transitioning to a petrol state. And we are talking about tremendous poverty in the presence of tremendous wealth. And I tried to argue in the National Assembly that that's not PPP fault, PNC fault. Those are structural problems that have followed us from slavery to the present. And as we engage this new era of wealth, the poverty is following us. And especially the poverty among the brown and the Black section of our population. And insofar as governments can be faulted, is their inability to recognize those structural problems and policies in this time of plenty to deal with the question. So I would commend Rodney's model of development and underdevelopment as the prism through which we can engage present-day Guyana. And I'll stop there because there's a lot, I think, that we can talk about as we engage. So I thank you very much and thank the audience very much for tolerating the few thoughts and comments on this really very, very important book. It's easily the most important book on Black studies in the last 60 years. It's easily the most important book on African history in the last 60 years. It's easily the most recognizable book written by a Guyanese. And we Guyanese have written so many books about, not just about Guyana and the Caribbean, but about the world. But Rodney's All Europe Underdeveloped Africa is perhaps the most recognizable. And I think we have to big ourselves up. We are a small nation. Professor Rex Netherford used to say, we have not given the world leaning towers and skyscrapers and big bridges, despite what our government is doing. We are never going to be known for giving the world big bridges, but we have given the world a continent, which is our mind. Yeah. And Walter Rodney is among the finest minds to come out of our Guyana and the Caribbean. And he comes from a generation or a series of generations of intellectual giants. So he's a giant among giants. And this book is really testimony. It's about youth. It's about youth It's about me that we can go anywhere in the world and look anyone in the eye and say, we are the children of our Europe underdeveloped Africa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hinds, for that insightful presentation. We will now open the floor for questions.
Hello, good evening.
Go ahead, Mr. Phillips. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, David, for wonderful explanation. I agree with you that underdevelopment in Guyana is structural. It has an historical context. But if you were to look at the GDP gains over the last 5 years, when we started with oil, the GDP was around $6,000 US dollars per person, GDP per capita. Now it's almost 36. And African Guyanese GDP hasn't moved much. A lot of it is racially driven in terms of how contracts are provided. So, along with the institutional, structural problems we have with underdevelopment and poverty in Guyana, there's a racial and political one. Can you comment on that?
Yes. Thank you, Brother Eric, and thank you, Brother Eric, for the work that you do and continue to do to keep some of these issues alive in a place where it's not hospitable to really deal with these issues. I completely agree with you. And again, I go back to Rodney. Rodney is usually described as a Marxist, and he was a Marxist. But perhaps the text that comes near to this text is, again, a small compilation of some speeches that he gave while in Jamaica. That's called that's called Groundings with My Brother. All right, this is his Black Power text. And so to understand Rodney, one has to understand the synthesis of class and race. People, talk about Rodney as a Marxist dealing with class analysis, and don't talk about the Rodney that deals with race analysis. So Rodney argues, for example, that I deal with the question of race today, so that tomorrow I don't have to deal with it, I can move on to class, right? So Rodney engaged race. And as Rodney grappled with Guyana, he would agree with Brother Eric that part of the problem of underdevelopment in a society like ours has to be ethnic and racial underdevelopment because of the different experiences. Native Indians were here, and there was genocide of Native Indians. And so coming out of that, there's a Native Indian gaze. There's a Native Indian story that they tell the world coming out of that genocide. They got 400 years of enslavement. This year we are celebrating, I hope we're going to celebrate 400 years of Africans arriving in this country. And that slavery as well fundamental to in terms, one would argue then from an economic standpoint that African Guyanese, African Caribbean people are the underdeveloped of the underdeveloped because they were directly impacted by slavery. And so when we speak about the structural poverty, the structural challenges, we have to speak about them at two levels. We have to speak to them at the level of the collective multiracial society or land of six races, but we also have to equally speak about that underdevelopment at the level of African Guyanese. If you take enslavement away from Caribbean history, from Guyanese history, from African history, the face of those places changed drastically. And so therefore, Brother Eric is correct. We have to contend, as Rodney argued. He said, I would rather be talking about some other things. I would rather be talking about, a European society. But I have to talk about race, not because I invented race, but because race was used to dehumanize the African. And if race is used to dehumanize the African, then the African must use the racial prism, not prison, in order to humanize himself. And so to understand the human condition in Guyana today, one has to look at it at two levels. At the level of the larger society where the ethnic groups are contending and mixing, and insofar as we can say we are a nation, some people argue we are not quite a nation, we are a pre-nation, all right? But we have to look at it fundamentally as a large part of it as the African problem.
Thank you very much. Next question. What was the response of the white academic establishment to the book?
Listen, when Rodney, sent the manuscript for one of his old professors at the School of Oriental and African Study, he condemned it. He said, this is a political pamphlet. This was like an academic text. He didn't have notation and he couldn't cite his sources and all of that stuff. And I'll tell you something that Walter Rodney said to us when we were young revolutionaries, not even ready to go to universities. He said, I'm an academic. And academics must have a purpose. You're not writing books and thinking through issues just for the sake of thinking them through. There must be a political outcome, right? And so they say, Europe underdeveloped Africa as a political outcome that Rodney is looking for. And the political outcome, I'm not talking about party politics, what the Americans would say the small p, right? It is to change the way African people think about themselves. You go to a place like Haiti, that's perhaps the richest country I've been to in the world. They say it's the poorest country economically. But I tell you, when you go to that place, it's like everybody has a painted brush in their hand. And you see the murals. Oh, my Jesus. Every time I go to that place, I said, yes, I am in paradise, because it is paradise. So what Rodney is saying in this book, and saying to white people, is that you will bring a European gaze to Africa. And that's your political gaze, whether you call it academics, whatever you call it. You're bringing because you're influencing political policy towards Africa, towards Black people, and so forth. And so therefore, when I engage Africa and issues of Blackness, I'm engaging it from the standpoint of a Black person. And so therefore, this is now going to influence Black people, how they see themselves, how they see their struggle, and how they see their place in the world. So they were visceral. But today, a lot of them are teaching.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hinds. Next question. What's the relevance of the book to contemporary Guyana?
Thank you for that question. And Eric and I started to talk about that. Look, we are dealing with the question of development and underdevelopment today. And as I said, as I sat in the National Assembly and listened to the debates on that $1.5 trillion, and I'm saying a lot of that money is money that is owed to African Guyanese. I consulted Brother Eric among other people, and they were telling me, the estimation of how much African Guyanese is owed is between 100 and 131 trillion dollars. And we talk about a budget of $1.5 trillion, right? And so that's the first relevance. The first relevance is that we are now getting the kind of resources that the labor of our people was able to realize, but never came to us. And here it is coming to us, despite the fact that a lot of it is going away. So that's the first relevance. The second relevance is the very model of development and underdevelopment. We hear our government, but there are people who are not in the government talking how developed Guyana is. Guyana is developing. And I said, have you read Walter Rodney? Huh? This is not development, right? This is the coming together, the conference, the collision of European extraction and some trickle down to us that we are calling development, some roads and some bridges. But human development is not keeping up with the infrastructural development. And so the question of underdevelopment and development is really very much alive in Guyana. There are two conversations. There's a conversation that is going on about how developed Guyana is. That's the GDP, the highest per capita income, the highest this and the highest that. And then there's the conversation about underdevelopment, the cries of the Black woman who has to leave home at 6 o'clock in the afternoon to go and watch man somebody place until 6 o'clock in the morning, leaving her children or your children to the ravages of the night. She is engaging what is happening as underdevelopment, not development. And so we have conversations to bring the conversations together in a dialectical way. And I think that's what I was trying to signal to the National Assembly, and that is what the conversation I think we have to have. Ethics of underdevelopment in the era of oil and gas.
Yeah. Since we're on the topic of exporting raw materials, can you say that Rodney's book would be relevant today in the context of how our oil or petroleum is basically being exported? And how we spoke about, exporting these raw materials to the mother country or whichever European country or to the African countries get nothing. Little to nothing.
Yeah, one of my colleagues from Grenada was visited over the weekend, and I got a chance to catch up with her yesterday. And she said, David, you almost getting cheap gas in Guyana. You can only gas station. What a relevant question. And I think that's it. Our gas doesn't touch Guyana. Our oil doesn't touch Guyana. It's offshore. But this business never touches here. And so it does not have a direct impact on what's happening on prices here in Guyana, on standard of living in Guyana. The extractive industry and the extractive framework is very much at play, and in a brutal way, because you're extracting our resources never to touch our land, and it's gone. And so the whole issue of extraction of raw material is very much at play here in Guyana. And like I said, the Rastaman said, you never go back, you always come forward. But David Rudder said, the more things change, rearrange, everything remains the same. So as we rearrange, we are engaging these models. And Walter Rodney book, like I said, is more than just a book. It's a model. It's a model of how our raw material is being extracted and how that influences on the development. And what is very important here about underdevelopment is Rodney's talking about underdevelopment, a human underdevelopment. He uses religion as one of the ways to show how religion helped to develop indigenous religion in Africa, develop Africa, and how an imposed religion from outside of Africa had an opposite effect on Africa. So he's widening the gaze to help us understand ourselves.
Very good. Mr. Philip is asking, how do we raise the collective consciousness of the country, all of the parliament leaders from all sources, etc., towards understanding our country and history? People like Rodney has given us lens through which we can save our country.
Yeah, oh boy. Eric knows that there are a few of us. And the work has to continue. G has to continue, the work that G is doing, the work that Reparations Committee is doing, and we're producing young people like yourself. And I think that is where I see the work continuing. We, the older ones, we are still around, we are still engaged in the issues, we are still out there taking blows, But I think we have to, if I may answer Eric directly, we have to find a way to remove the fear from our people. And one of the criticisms of Rodney's book by his detractors is that the book doesn't give the people of Africa agency. This is a term in academia, where we have agency. Well, if you are enslaved, what kind of agency are you talking about? No, you have power. You have the power to fight and overthrow the slave system, as our brothers and sisters did in Haiti, as our brothers and sisters did here in 1760 in Barbados. You have the power to do that. But when these white people come in these terms like agency, people are beating you up and you're talking about agency to take blows. And so what Rodney was doing is that he was highlighting the injustice. No injustice. Where there's injustice, there is resistance to injustice. But you're saying, well, maybe, people have agency. Rodney did not engage how African people did damage to themselves, how African people did involve in the slave trade, and so on. Well, all of those things pale in insignificance to what the institution of slavery did to us at the level of family, at the level of community, at the level of region, at the level of what we now call country, and at the level of the world. So, we have to, Eric, continue to birth new Rodneys and young people who not engage in this thing because they want to, get some benefit. Benefits will come, I can tell you, Eric and myself, and Vincent and all of us who are engaged. We get benefits. People know us, people give us accolades for what we do. But our commitment is what is most important. And so for my brother Eric, I would say, let's keep that commitment and let's try to translate that commitment into birthing new, younger, fresher, inquisitive, and brave voices and faces that are 10 times younger than mine.
Yeah. How does Rodney describe the role of European banks and financial companies in shaping African economy during colonialism? And in what ways did these institutions reinforce dependency and underdevelopment?
It will take an entire night, but I think that is such a relevant question because the European institutions, I think it's in chapter 3 that Rodney engaged the role of European institutions like the banks and so on, and the role they played in Africa and in our Caribbean. Dr. Eric Williams, who preceded Dr. Rodney, capitalism and slavery, and he argued very strenuously that it was West Indian labor that really became the raw material, the investment, the capital that was used in Europe to build capitalism and to build the European countries into what they are today. And I think we are off from Williams' work and look at the role of institutions. And that is why today, as we engage the reparations argument, the reparations discussion, we have to do it at several levels. The role of the state, the role of these institutions, like the banking institutions, and the role of the successor states. So a state like Guyana, which is a successor state to the slave state, to the colonial state. And
David, also the role of the
this
church.
state did not have the resources to help to repair Africa. Now it has the resources, and we're arguing that it must be part of the reparation solution. And so yes, the banks in America and England, they have relationship, with banks in Guyana. Some of these slave banks, the banks that benefited from slavery, they now have relations with banks and lending institutions in places like Guyana and Africa and the Caribbean. So yes, they played a very, very important role in the underdevelopment of African.
Brother Eric is saying the church as well.
Yes. And I have hinted that Rodney was very cognizant of the role of religion in development You know, we, when black people came here and they saw Christianity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, they warm to it because they're talking for something. They come from places with a God, God for sun, God for rain, God for water, God for this, God for that. So they are accustomed to multiple deities. And so it's one of the reasons that they're hooked to Christianity to a certain extent. I would like to argue that in some regards, we have humanized Christianity. Coming out of it, our faithists, you talk to a faithist person, a comfort person, say, but I'm a Christian, but I'm an African Christian. Looking at the world, the cosmos, looking at religion through African eyes. They are up there in the altar with the table. So they use some of the Christian thing, but what they've done is humanize Christianity with a black gaze and saying that we are humans too.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Our final question. How do we help the youth remove the fear of being considered racist by studying African history?
Big blows. You know, when I got to the point in my so-called maiden speech last week in the National Assembly, I was going well and they were tickling me here and there. But when I got to the point of reparations and International Decade of the People of African Descent, it was the African on the government side who went berserk. Who, it's like something woke up in them. And they began to blows me and call me all kinds of names. And so I'm saying the way you remove fear is to fight fear, to stand up. I and Eric and Sister Olive and Vincent, and I don't want to leave out names because they're legions and yourself and so on. They have to prepare to take the blows. They call me racist. And they know I am not a racist. All right? But they call me racist as a way of burying my voice. All right? But I am prepared to take that blows because, as you know, Brother Fidel Castro famously said, history will absolve me. I think history will absolve us. All right? So the thing is that we have to put our bodies on the line. And I'm not talking here about the physical body only, but we have to put everything that we have on the line. I thank Guyana. I thank my village, Buxton. I thank Black people, African people. I thank my family for what I have become. I thank Walter Rodney and Guyana and others for what I have become. If someone had told me that I would be sitting on a podcast in 2026 February, talking about Walter Rodney, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, I would say no. The most I could have, you know, ambition is to become a teacher. I wanted to become a priest and all of that stuff. And nobody could tell me that. But here I am, doing this. And so therefore one has to be thankful for where the society has brought us, the kind of consciousness that the society has given us, because consciousness is not something that you develop from your belly. Consciousness comes from the belly of the society and enters your belly and comes forth. And so therefore we have to continue to engage this subject fearlessly. We have to call best in us. We have to I went back and read the first chapter in All Europe Underdeveloped Africa as I prepare. We have to go back to some of the old canons, the old texts, the Axman's white mask. You know, my brother is going to deal with Kwame Nkrumah's philosophy of the African personality, and I'm looking forward to Professor Hicks engaging that subject. It's a book that I read way back. I remember Kimani, brother Kimani Nehusi is the person who first gave me a copy of Nkrumah's book dealing with that. And And so we have to go back to those fundamental texts. I don't want to desecrate the Bible and all those things are important in terms of religion, but in terms of our journey, our quest to free ourselves continuously from the ravages of a society that don't want to see us free. They don't mind us being around so long as we are not free. And we have to understand that. And so, therefore, we have to continue to hung the way, we have to continue to take the blows, and we have to stand up and look them in the eye. As I always say, I take tremendous pride in watching the so-called colored elites in this country and poke in the face, because that was not to be. And now I can do it because of education. Now I can do it because of political activism. And I want to do it so that some young person, some young woman like yourself, will be able to do it tomorrow.
Yeah. Brother Eric is saying teaching of history in our schools is critical to the political and economic sorry. Teaching of history in our schools is critical to the political and economic evolution of African Guineans. Our contributions have been deliberately hidden from all, it's moving, sorry, from all Guineans because racial entrepreneurs want younger people not to know that we cleared 15,000 square miles and were here before the YYs, Wafichianos, Bushi, all Brazilians and all our colonials.
That is so correct. And I tell you, Sister Kizzy, where they cut us off from the schools, we have to create our own school. I am retired now. I have a little bit more time, but still busy. But through the encouragement of a pastor, I was able to teach a 10-week course on Introduction to Pan-Africanism. Brother Eric gave a lecture, a guest lecture on one of the topics in that course. And we had about 60 students in that course. And, I hope I find the time to move from a course, two courses, to an online Black school where we can mind it. Our next course, which should have started this month, but because of the budget thing, I couldn't. But hopefully, the ancestors will give me the strength to move it next month. Is going to be introduction to Africans in Guyana. And I hope if young people are here in this program that they can enroll for that class. So where they block us from the schools, we are going to create schools and, but continue to fight so that our Black history, our Black culture can get in to the formal school system. But even as we fight, we are going to create our own niches.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hinds. As we end tonight's podcast, we ask you to kindly visit Castellani House for the Black History Month exhibition from the Guyana Reparations Committee, 400 Years in Guyana. Thank you very much. See you next week. Bye.